Hello and welcome to Deep Green Productions. Today we're very fortunate to have with us Professor Richard D. Wolff, who is perhaps best known as the host of the very popular monthly radio series Economic Update, a series that attempts to make sense of the current economic, social, and political scene in a way that ties the three of those elements together from a socialist perspective. Welcome, Professor Wolff.
Thank you very much, Dick. I'm glad to make your acquaintance in this electronic way and have a good conversation.
We're especially glad to hear from you today because there seems to be a change in the attitude towards socialism. It wasn't that long ago that it was illegal to be a member of the Communist Party, and the public had been so heavily propagandized into thinking that socialism was the same as Soviet communism. To provide a bit of background for those who may not be familiar with socialism, can you explain briefly what it is and where it came from?
Yeah, I think that socialism represents the shadow of the capitalist system. If we date capitalism, as most folks do, as a system that emerged out of the disintegration of feudalism in Europe, a system of lords and serfs that was in place for 1,000 years before, and that fell apart more or less in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, then what we had was a transition out of feudalism, the end of lords and serfs, the end of the old aristocracies, the absolute monarchies, and all of that, and the replacement by what we take for granted these days, a system where people are not serfs, where they're not slaves, where they are quote unquote free to make whatever working arrangements they see fit to make, and that the people are divided largely between employer, that's a very small number, and employee, and that's a very large number. And they interact with one another by means of contracts rather than by means of personal obligations, as was the case in feudalism. Now, what is socialism is really, it's the self-criticism of capitalism. It is what developed alongside capitalism as the people who lived through the transition and who came after the transition into capitalism began to believe, based on their experiences, that the human race could and should do better than this capitalism. Let me explain as briefly as I can. The revolution that brought capitalism into the modern European world was above all the French Revolution of 1789. It overthrew feudalism. It literally killed off the absolute kings who governed France at the time. It got rid of lords and serfs. It reduced the role of the Roman Catholic Church from its dominance to a shadow of its former power and self. And it worked along with the basic slogan, liberty, equality, fraternity. And the basic argument was, if you get rid of feudalism, lords and serfs, and you establish instead capitalism, private enterprises, private property, contracts that make one group of people work for other people, all of the apparatus of capitalism, this will be the way. That was the promise of the French Revolution, to realize a society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. What socialism is, and always has been, is a movement of people who basically say that promise made by capitalism at its birth has never been kept. That capitalism has not at the beginning, nor over the last 250 years, nor today, been the vehicle it promised to be. It hasn't brought liberty, it hasn't brought equality, and it hasn't brought brotherhood anywhere, and gives no sign of its ability or capability of doing that. And so people have said, look, we need to come up with a name for what we believe as critics of capitalism. And if they thought about it for a long time, which they did, here's what they came up with. What capitalism seemed to do is to enshrine the notion, which Adam Smith then made explicit, that if every person really only looks after number one, himself, herself, or in the language of Adam Smith, if everyone pursues their own self-interest, then it will, as if by magic, or in Adam Smith's word, as if led by the invisible hand of God, lead to the best outcome for society as a whole. Socialists have always scoffed at that idea. That is a thin, rationalizing veneer for a society that says to everybody, go out there and kick and bite and scratch and scream for your own advance and let the devil take the hindmost. Socialists have been the ones that say, no, no, no. If you want a society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity, you have to construct it. You have to build that society, and you have to make social good, social well-being the top priority, not individual self-advancement. So they came up with the name socialists. Our focus is on society on the whole, and we're not about to underwrite individualism, which we think fuels a capitalism that does not only fail to bring us closer to liberty, equality, and fraternity, but mostly drives us away from that. And that's why today, in the world today, when the statistics show a growing gap between rich and poor that is stupefying, that show us a society so mad about economic self-aggrandizement that it literally threatens the planet upon which we depend. If you look at these dimensions of modern capitalism, I think you understand why the audience that is now in the process of rediscovering socialism, after roughly a half a century of it being the kind of taboo you described at the beginning of the show, I think you can understand why that rediscovery is very intense right now, and like a wave carries people like me to audiences around the world that I frankly never dreamed that I would see in my lifetime.
Are there people like you out in the world today?
Loads of them, and more coming every day. Let me give you just two examples. I have done more public speaking across the United States, in churches, in union halls, in large concert halls. I have done more public speaking about capitalism and socialism in the last 4 years than I did in the previous 40 years. That gives you some idea. I do a radio or television interview every day, at least one, sometimes 4 and 5. I live in Manhattan. Limousines come to my apartment building, pick me up, whisk me elsewhere in Manhattan to a TV studio where I will talk to anything from 20,000 to 20 million people, anywhere from 2 minutes to 20 minutes or longer. In the United States, I'm not clear about how much of this comes to New Zealand, but we have 4 or 5 major television interview programs. Bill Moyers, Charlie Rose. As I say, I don't know if they come to New Zealand, but they're as big as you get here in the United States, and I've basically been on all those programs. The comedian Bill Maher, who has an audience of millions, had me on his show a few months ago, where the opening 8.5 minutes, that's how he begins his show, was a conversation between Bill Maher and me on the topic he chose of Marxism, and the American people were treated to 8.5 minutes of a perfectly reasonable, normal adult conversation between a comic they love and a Marxist, so identified, who had neither horns nor did he act in any way that people would find other than interesting, whether they agreed with it or not. I think that's a sign of how both the United States and the rest of the world are changing as they rediscover that the critics of capitalism have some very important insights, and they have a lot to offer to a society whose commitment to capitalism is becoming thinner by the minute.
I can certainly see that. One of the voices that I hear quite a lot on the internet is from the libertarian groups that seem to align themselves with the personal responsibility and the old Constitution. I'm wondering if you're finding opposition from them.
No, they usually leave us alone. They're split, the libertarians. First of all, they're not quite as powerful as you might imagine. They get a lot of press. They're very careful. They don't make criticisms of capitalism most of the time. So they're not perceived in the mass media. And I should underscore that in the United States, the mass media are all private enterprises. The government plays almost no role. There is a national public radio and television system, but it is a very small competitor to what is overwhelmingly a private enterprise and highly concentrated. 6 media companies basically control the television and so forth in this country. Having said that, the libertarians are very careful. They're libertarians on matters of politics. They're libertarians on matters of foreign policy. They're libertarians on matters of civil rights and civil liberties. But when it comes to economics, they are enthusiastic cheerleaders for capitalism. Even the few among them who understand that big business capitalism and libertarian ideology are very strange bedfellows, even for them, they're very diffident. They're very careful. And what they will say is that we do have a capitalism that has gotten a little bit away from the libertarian ideal, and therefore we have a need to go back to what they like to call genuine capitalism. This way they can show how loyal they are to capitalism, how far away they are from socialism. So at this point, they function mostly on the right wing of American political life, even though some of them as individuals are able to see that we on the left do have some things in common with them, but they're very worried because of the American history of having any association with the left, because for the last 50 years, roughly since 1945, it has been a taboo, as you noted yourself. It has been a taboo in the United States, and we're only like a bear in the spring coming out of the hibernation as a nation, so that it is all very exciting for young people who are open to it. And as the older generations pass away, they take with them to the grave the taboo against socialism.
What do we need to overcome in order to break through?
I think there are two big problems. A huge portion of the United States has lost both confidence in, and it is so extreme, I would go so far as to say, lost much interest in what passes for politics here. The majority view is that politicians are a special kind of careerist, literally a business alongside others. So some people go into sports, and some people go into teaching, and then some people go into politics. It's like a career choice, and then you become part of a small group of people who scrabble as far up in the system as they can, who run elections, who do favors for whoever you have to do favors for to get votes. And in the process, it has become narrower and narrower. So the only people who really play in the political game are those who both have something they can get in the way of a favor from a politician and who have something they can give to the politician to get the favor. So the major players are financial interests, and that ranges from the real estate developer in the city who needs zoning laws and ordinances passed to make money building an apartment house here or an industrial park or a shopping center, or you have a corporation that wants better deals with harbors and foreign trade. And those are the major players. We now have a politics that is extremely expensive. To run a campaign requires that you buy huge amounts of public advertising, which means you have to raise huge amounts of money, which means you are even more beholden to the people who can give you large amounts of money. So the politics has become more and more insular, more and more a minority matter, and most people in most elections don't bother to vote, but even those who vote, a huge proportion of them don't vote on anything like basic questions of social organization or basic questions of policy. They go to vote because some particular interest has activated them. For example, they go because they would like prayer to be added to the school day in a public school, or they want the right to carry a gun, or they feel very strongly about abortion, or they want desperately to stop immigration. They have some particular issue and they mobilize for that. But the number of people who vote because they are concerned about the general direction of political decision making, it's tiny. I mean, it's literally, if it were 10%, I'd be impressed. I doubt it's that. Most people who go to vote go out of some vague notion that they ought to. They have not paid attention. They could not tell you, we have thousands of polls to prove this. They could not tell you what the political differences between the parties are, what their platforms are. They can't most of the time tell you who's actually running. It's a silly process. The political machines, which only exist in the cities, are less and less capable even of bringing their faithful, their stalwarts to the polls. It's an apoliticized society. And what passes for politics is actually an endless series of highly staged, publicly paid for theatrics. A theatrics of the candidate, a theatrics of the people around them, staged demonstrations in carefully controlled auditoriums to make it look like something important. And, you know, even that doesn't work very much because most people do not care. And they think that the political system is irrelevant to them. Let me give you the simplest example. Last week here in the United States, the oldest and most reputable of our polling institutions, called the Gallup poll, it's been around a long time, released one of its very interesting studies. Every 5 years since 1984, they have asked the American people two questions on the issue of income distribution, wealth distribution. So the first question is, do you feel that the distribution of wealth and income in America is fair or unfair, and tell us why? And last week they released their most recent poll. 63%, that's just a little less than 2/3 of Americans randomly polled, believe that the distribution of wealth and income in America is unfair and tilts in favor of the rich. And the poll also showed that since 1984, this number hasn't changed much. It's been in the middle to low 60% continuously for 30 years. Then they asked a second question. Do you believe that it would be appropriate to heavily tax, that was the phrase, heavily tax rich people in order to fix the unfair distribution of wealth and income. And in the last week, the poll result was 52% of Americans are in favor of heavily taxing the rich to fix the problem. And that has grown over 30 years. In 1984, only 40% of Americans were in favor of heavily taxing the rich, but it has grown steadily and is now a majority point of view. Okay, that means that for 30 years, a very big majority of people have been against the unfair distribution of wealth and income, and a growing number want to tax rich people heavily. Okay, that's the opinion of the American people. What has the political establishment done in 30 years? The exact opposite. They have passed tax reforms and policy changes, every one of which has ended up, whether you look at them individually or together, to worsen the distribution of wealth and income. It's like a straight line for 30 years. Nothing could better illustrate the disconnect between what people in America think and what the political establishment does. And I could give you other examples, but that summarizes it in a very nice way. And so the biggest problem for socialism is that people don't believe it's possible. They're not going to rev up their hopes. They're not going to rev up their dreams. They're not going to become active because the notion that anything could develop that could disturb, undo, open up the closed space of politics strikes most people as totally fantastical. Occasionally, a politician comes along who figures out, almost always with the aid of a highly paid advertising firm, how to present himself or herself as though they weren't going to repeat everything. That's why almost every American politician presents himself as, quote, a Washington outsider, i.e., somebody who's not part of what everybody knows stinks. That was, in a way, why you saw a little bit of interest sparked around the candidacy of Barack Obama. Because when a young black face stands up, he doesn't have to say he's not a Washington insider. You just have to look at him, and you know that the only place in Washington where he goes is the slum that is Washington, which is the majority of what Washington is. So people began to think, well, maybe something will be really different. After 8 years, Mr. Obama has proved that he's no different from any of the others. His color of his skin is different, but he's part of the same process. So that's gone. And Mrs. Clinton couldn't in a million years do this, and Mr. Bush and the other candidates. In other words, as we say here in the United States, same old, same old. Nothing has changed. That's the biggest obstacle. So that even the entry of a person who's identified as a socialist, Bernie Sanders, a senator from Vermont, who has now entered the race, but even that will be questioned in most people's mind because the notion that he could ever get anywhere strikes people as fanciful. So he'll get votes by people who are disaffected, but he can't break the basic inertia that has developed. Having said that, I should also say, because that's what's remarkable in America now, before you had closed the socialists out, you had this tight group, and they were considered in charge because whatever your criticisms were, as we like to say in the United States, capitalism delivers the goods, which is a none too subtle way of saying, after all is said and done, the standard of living of most people is either flat or rising. Since 2008, that is no longer the case. We are now the 7th year into a decline in the standard of living for American workers, the vast majority, and they are therefore questioning capitalism. They are becoming interested in socialism, not because they know or care or like socialism. They are becoming open to socialism because they are becoming very disaffected from the status quo.
Do you think that's what's going to tip the balance that will finally get people up and motivated and charged up enough that they'll make a change?
I don't know. That's a good question. All I can tell you is, for the first time in my adult life, the wind has changed, and so it is possible that that will happen. And up until very recently, I would have said not in my lifetime. But now, the pace of change of the last few years has been so astonishing in terms of openness to this kind of critical thinking, that I would have to answer your question. People are changing. I like to remember a famous politician's comment on that kind of a question, when he was asked, and he answered, "For many decades, nothing seems to happen. And then in a few weeks, decades happen." I think we are seeing the building up to a set of explosive changes, which, when they come, will be very fast and very sweeping. We have seen the first example of that in the autumn of 2011 with the explosion of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Now, it was a flash in the pan, but what a flash it was. In a matter of 2 to 3 months, there were tent cities established by tens of thousands of activated Americans across 350 cities in this country. Nobody had seen a mobilization like that, and that was remarkable. And many of those people were activated for the first time in their lives, and they continue to be active in different ways. And I don't know whether the next upsurge against capitalism will call itself Occupy Wall Street, whether it will take name like socialism, or where it'll go. But the possibility of that, the strength of that, that's growing all the time. And to be a little grim, but you have to be, the movement in capitalist countries around the world to establish repressive laws and repressive institutions to hold mass protests down. Take a look at what the Spanish parliament passed this last week, that you can fine people hundreds of thousands of dollars if they protest near a public building, if they gather in a public square. We have that everywhere. Everywhere there's a growing anxiety on the part of the political in-group that their days are numbered and they want to intimidate, because that's the only method of control that they fear they have left.
Does Ferguson fall into part of that process?
Absolutely. You cannot ask the police force of this country, because of its conditions, I'll be as polite as I can, because of its past, because of its record, because of its alienation from the communities of the poor, to ask the police to step in, given the bad things they've done in the past, given the disaffection. That's impossible. That won't work. That will produce murder. That will produce violence. First, the violence of those who don't want the police in their communities, then the violence of the police who are frightened by being asked to maintain control in a situation spinning out of control. Everybody is bitter about where they are. This is not a problem of the police. This is a systemic breakdown in which we can only expect rising horror from the police and rising horror from the people that the police are being told to keep in line. It is an impossible situation, and it is on the head and on the responsibility of the people who run this society that they have been running it into the ground. And let me be clear that that's what's happening. Capitalism as a system was born and raised and grew. And this must be of particular importance to New Zealand, what I'm about to tell you. Capitalism was born in England in the 17th and 18th century. It spread from there to Western Europe, from there to North America, then to the Commonwealth areas that you know real well, since New Zealand is one, and then to Japan. Those are the areas of the system's birth. And for the first 250, 300 years, it concentrated its activities there. The factories were built there. The offices were built there. The stores were built there. But then in the 1970s, with the development of modern jet aircraft, where you could go to any corner of the globe in a matter of hours, and the development of modern telecommunications, the internet, the very mechanism that allows you and me to have this conversation, capitalists in the areas, the old centers, understood something of historic importance. They could make more profit by leaving the areas in which they had been born, the areas that had become wealthy in the growth of capitalism, and move production from England or America or Japan to China and India and Brazil and so on. The best example I know of, the city of Detroit. In 1970, one of the paragon examples of successful capitalism. Presidents of the United States would bring foreign dignitaries to Detroit. See, they would tell them, a city of 2 million people with good jobs, in a good union. You could even see large numbers of African Americans working side by side with white people in the United Auto Workers, the most powerful union in the country at that time. Capitalism successful, the automobile a profitable industry revolutionizing life across the country. That was in 1970. Fast forward with me today. Detroit is today the largest city ever to enter bankruptcy in the history of the United States. The population today, 700,000 people. That means 1.3 million out of the 2 million. A big majority driven out of the city. There are no jobs. There are no homes. There are no stores. The city is like a bombed out wasteland when you travel there. One of the biggest problems of Detroit today, and I hope this sinks in New Zealand, is the problem of wild dogs. You know, I don't have the imagination to make this up. Let me explain. As the millions of people left Detroit because there were no jobs, they took their children, they took their furniture. They didn't take the dog because they couldn't afford it. So they said goodbye, a tearful goodbye to the dog on the front lawn. The dog then had umpteen abandoned homes to live in, where the dogs went. And there they did what dogs and other animals do, producing more dogs. Meanwhile, the city of Detroit, losing population, meaning people couldn't pay taxes anymore, had no revenue. So it fired large numbers of its public employees, starting with the dog wardens, they're called. These are the people charged with collecting stray dogs. So now you had an explosion of dogs and no system to control for them. They are now threatening, biting, and in some cases, eating children. That's New York City future if we don't change things. It's already the story of Cleveland. It's already the story of the poor parts of St. Louis, of which Ferguson is a part. I could go on, but we're watching a capitalism that is seeing the capitalists abandon it. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler are much more interested in building cars in China and India in the years ahead. They're not going to build them in Detroit. And the government and the capitalists as a whole have been watching the disintegration of Detroit for 40 years, and they've been unable, not the mayor, not the governor, not the president, to do anything to stop it. And they haven't stopped it anywhere else. And Americans are not so blind that they don't see the handwriting on every wall. That's what's fueling interest in socialism more than anything else.
It's understandable. I'd like to switch gears a little bit now, if I can, and ask you about some personalities and get your reaction to them, if you wouldn't mind. What do you think of Paul Krugman?
Very interesting, a person whose work I know because, like him, I'm a professor of economics all my adult life. What's interesting about him is that he has been very disappointed by the stodginess of the economics profession, by its unwillingness to face the colossal failure of capitalism, either to understand its own capacity for crisis, nor to then understand why this crisis cut so deep. I'm talking about the one since 2008. Before that, Paul Krugman wasn't that remarkable an economist. He was famous, but he was part of the establishment of the economics profession. But since the crisis, he has become a critic. And he has, in a sense, rediscovered Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes, after all, exploded onto the popular consciousness in the midst of the last great breakdown of capitalism in the 1930s. And you can think of Paul Krugman as having, in this new crisis, since 2008, having rediscovered and trying to persuade the American audience that Keynes was right in the 1930s, and we need to return to his insights now. And he's very bitter and disappointed that the dominance of the capitalist class in this country makes the reception for his effort much less than what he would wish for.
How about Chris Hedges?
Chris Hedges is as close as you can get right now in the United States to what I would call the prophet of our time. He is remarkable. He grew up and became a reporter for the New York Times, among other newspapers. And, you know, in that capacity, he was sent into some of the most difficult areas, and right up close and personal, he witnessed what American foreign and domestic policy are. He is a person who is trained as a student of divinity, of the religious morality approach to life, but is a hard-nosed thinker and has carved out a place for himself as the person willing to look down into the abyss of what could be America's future and to tell everybody in very poetic language what he sees and what he thinks is coming if people don't wake up. And even more interesting than what he does is the spectacular interest that Americans have in what he has to say. It's as though something has snapped in the American consciousness where before nobody wanted to look at these things. Now they know they have to, and Chris Hedges is the person they turn to when they're ready to hear just how bad it looks.
What about Russell Brand?
Wonderful comedic way of getting at it. We had someone like that. I mean, he's different, but we had a comedian named George Carlin. I don't know if he comes over there and whether you're aware of him. Very, very effective in the United States. A product of the 1960s, a social critic. He died a few years ago, and we're waiting for someone to come and replace him. Meanwhile, Russell Brand is a sensation among young people because of his youthful, fresh enthusiasm for a criticism of capitalism is exactly the way Americans now want to hear that kind of thinking.
How about Paul Craig Roberts?
That's a good question. The person, because of his strange trajectory coming through the Republican Party establishment, he and his age, he is somebody that surprises a lot of people because of the level of his criticism. But when they look into where it comes from, they don't know quite what to make of him. So I think he's a bit of an enigma.
Indeed. Last one. How about David Stockman?
I don't think more than half a dozen people have any idea of who or what he is. For those who do, he is a vague echo from the Reagan years, who got himself into trouble when he ventured a very modest criticism that at least part of the motivation for the economic policies of his time was the greed of rich people. That is really so well understood now that nobody gets very far by making such a comment. It's become common sense, and he's faded out because too many other people have said it since him, so nobody hardly remembers that he said it at a time when, at least for a high-level advisor who was a Republican, it was a bit strange.
Right. Well, that's enough of the personalities. Going back to some of the bigger questions, Marx wrote about religion being the opiate of the masses. Do you think there is a place for religion in modern socialism?
Absolutely. You know, religion, ideology, whatever you want to call it, the way people make sense of the meaning of life, that's part of life. It was part of life before capitalism. It'll be part of life after capitalism. Religion also takes many, many different forms. It's a little painful to see the protagonists of one or another denomination being narrow-minded and imagining that they're in a competition to see who wins, rather than understanding that religion, like points of view and belief systems and spiritual systems, are just the ways people have of trying to make sense of the passage from birth through death. And people in socialism will be doing that, and some of them will be finding meaning in the concept of a deity, others will be finding meaning in the concept of spirituality in nature, others will be finding it in the human community. I expect them to, I think they'll change over time, but that's a truism. They've changed in the past, they will change again. Even if sometimes the people who are so frightened by change need to pretend it isn't happening by attaching the same name to the thing. So we can call it Roman Catholicism, but believe me, the Roman Catholicism of Constantine or Diocletian or Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine or the current Pope Francis, this is a constantly evolving set of ideas, and that's true of every other religion as well. I used to find it funny that we have a tradition in which we call people by the same name. John, when he's 2 months old, John, when he's 12, John, when he's 30. John. This is crazy. That's not John. That's a different person who once was John. But I think it's been very hard for the human community to cope with death, to cope with change. And so we make efforts, more or less lame, to contain the scary part of it. And so we call you John for the whole period of your life, even though you know how different you have been, and so do the people around you.
Indeed. One of the topics that's come up on the internet that has captured a lot of attention is the notion of peak oil. Do you think socialism depends on the constant flow of cheap oil in order to survive the same way that capitalism does?
Not at all. The whole point of socialism is to sit down and to make rational decisions about the society and for the society. So the first thing is you don't make decisions based on private profit. We have a system of capitalism in which we allow energy to be an activity, the production and the distribution of energy to be an activity driven by profit. If you talk to the people who run ExxonMobil Corporation, for example, they will tell you correctly and honestly that they're in the oil business to make money. Under a socialist system, The purpose of oil is to serve the community. And if burning a lot of oil releases a lot of carbon and other kinds of waste into the system, that's not serving the community. So the standard of how we handle oil will be social well-being, not private profit. And so the decisions will be completely different. Likewise, if you decide not to produce a lot of oil, say, for example, because you refuse to have a private automobile transportation system, you substitute mass transport. Mass transportation does not have anywhere near as many fatalities in traffic accidents. It doesn't injure as many people. It uses much less fuel to move a person a mile, and it exudes into the atmosphere much less pollution of air and water. So if we were to move to public transportation as a community decision, because that's what socialism means, and then we didn't produce that much energy, then there would be a lot of people who don't have a job in the energy sector. But because we're a socialist society, we find other things for those people to do. And if we can't find other things for those people to do, we still give them jobs, because what we will do is reduce the number of hours that everybody has so that everybody has a job for 30 hours a week. Right? We would never put unemployment all on some people. That would be shared. A socialist society shares the benefit and it shares the costs. So I don't think the relationship in a socialist society between peak oil or the entire question of fossil fuel would show anything like the obsessive slavery to profit-driven energy industry that has been a hallmark of modern capitalism.
Brings us to our last question. I see we're running short on time. There seems to be a kind of a vector of this development of the oppressive nature of society, police crackdowns, consolidated control over the media, the oppressive changes to the government. Do you think there is a hidden hand with respect to those changes, an outside force, the Illuminati that some people would refer to? Do you see anything like that in the stuff that you've been looking at?
No, I don't. I think that the human race has been pretty creative in coming up with a set of insights about how societies work. And I think we now know that just like the economic systems before capitalism, slavery, feudalism, and so on, all of those systems were born at a particular time, grew and changed over a period of years, and then eventually disintegrated and died and were replaced by something else. Since that happened to every other system, despite the fact that in all those systems there were intellectuals and others who were absolutely convinced that their system was the best thing that had ever happened to the human race and would therefore last forever. I am not surprised that in the capitalist system that prevails now, there are likewise many voices assuring us that capitalism is the best thing that there could be and that it will last forever. I find that amusing. I find that childish. I find that flies in the face of the history of every other economic system. So I expect that capitalism, which was born 300 years ago, that has evolved and changed quite considerably, is also going to, and perhaps already has begun, to disintegrate and die, and that something else is coming to replace it. What that will be and how exactly that will work, I don't know, and I know that no one else does either. We have a few ideas of where to go. I think that workers running their own enterprises in a democratic way is a way forward for us. But how that'll all work out, I don't know. Just like the people who made the French, American, and British revolutions against feudalism had no clear idea of where they were going, and we have struggled ever since, I think the next social transition will be something like that, because that replicates a pattern we have now seen in all the economic systems of which we have a record.
Interesting times we live in. And with that, I think we're going to have to call an end to this interview. It's been fascinating, but I'd like to thank you very much for your time. And perhaps you could give us some references that we can use to follow up with where we can get hold of you.
Okay. The best way to follow our activities is to go to the websites that we maintain. They're available 24/7 at no charge whatsoever. The first one is rdwolff with 2fs.com. That's my website. And the other one, where we do this advocacy for democratic enterprises and a democratic economy, is called Democracy at Work, all one word, democracyatwork.info. So rdwolff.com and democracyatwork.info. And from there, you can get our free newsletters and you can access all kinds of activities that we are constantly developing and updating and so forth.
Again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Peg Hayes, and I appreciate the opportunity.